Hello, everyone. My name is not Ariana Scalfo, who usually does this podcast. My name is Trevor Tartaglia. I'm the newest coach here at Complete Human Performance and kind of the person leading the charge for our technological update with our templates and everything. So I've been coaching with CHP for a few months now. I've been coaching for 13 years now, so I have quite a lot of experience. And of course, with me, I have Alex, founder of CHP, kind of the originator of the hybrid training mentality. So this podcast might end up being kind of a series of podcasts where myself and some other coaches, hopefully Alex as much as he can, kind of dive into some more of the nitty gritty technical topics around training, some of the stuff about technology and kind of trying to add some parameters around training and whether that's useful, whether that applies to athletes in general and specifically hybrid athletes. So today the topic comes out from one of my CHP athletes. They asked the question of how should they account for TSS with their strength training, which is something that is a question I've gotten a lot. I have my own mentality around it. I'm sure, Alex, you have a lot of things to say about this. For those that are not familiar, TSS is a metric that was originally made by TrainingPeaks for cycling to try and estimate the amount of stress caused by a certain workout and attempt at least to account for variations in intensity and duration to give a score to how hard a workout was. And in general, it's a good metric. It's better to put a number on something than not at all, in my opinion. But there definitely are some problems with it, especially when you try and apply this idea outside of cycling, where everything is so measured and so even with power meters and everything. But before we get into this, Alex, I wanted to start off with a kind of just an introduction and kind of talk about some workouts that we've been enjoying lately. So maybe in the last couple of weeks or the last couple of months, maybe just this last week, is there a style of workout, a particular workout that you've specifically enjoyed doing in your training?
Man, that's a really, really good question. So, even just a couple months ago, moved up here to Boise/Eagle area. And, it was really, really tough because I was living in Southern California for a while. And, because Southern California is kind of this mecca for trail running and, all of this and, great weather year round. I could not find a good place to bike there at all. I was doing almost no road riding whatsoever. I moved out to Ramona and kind of the mountain areas when COVID started. And what that meant was every time I would take the bike out, the roads were deserted. I was like, oh, this is great. I was riding up to Julian. I was riding up Mount Palomar, which, you're probably familiar with it, but people are not. Like, it was, even part of the Tour of California. It's like 18 miles and like 4,000 something feet of gain, and like taking my mountain bike up the Nate Harrison grade behind. I was loving it. Then once COVID sort of, all the shutdowns ended and all the cars came back on the road, it was like playing Frogger when you were out there. Only, yeah, probably, and I was terrible at Frogger. I was probably even worse at dodging the cars out there. It was not something I like to do. So coming out here was actually great. Now I'm actually able to take the tri bike out and actually get it out there again. And one of the things I just loved that I finally was able to do this last weekend, but only for a short period of time because it's like 110 now, is Bogus Basin, which is a really good climb out here. I was so excited to find a place I could just let the bike point uphill and just put my head down. To me, that's like my favorite kind of workout now, is like no intervals, no mental engagement needed. You just put your head down and you try to stay on that suffering line just a little bit. It is the most mentally cleansing experience for me. And honestly, like, I know it sounds simple, but that has like been my favorite workout. It is just that ultimate, like, shut your brain down. There's nothing technical. There's no technical trail. There's not even anything to look at for most of the time. You're just staring at your stem. But that to me is like mentally all I can handle and all I need right now. So that's been my favorite.
Those long rides are really cool. It's something we don't have here in Quebec. Is there's no climbs that are more than 15, 20 minutes, so we don't have that long stuff. I remember this spring or this winter, I guess I was in San Francisco and they have Mount Tam, and it was like a 45-minute climb, and it's not something I used to. And it's just sitting there, easy cadence the whole time, giving a couple punches and the switchbacks. I like the going down the other side personally, but that's me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for me, also the rides I've been doing kind of similar. I've been doing a pretty big crit season on top of gravel. That 1 hour time frame is good for me. And one of the problems with racing weekly is trying to get in some good quality training. Because basically every Wednesday and most weekends I have some kind of race. So I haven't been doing a whole lot of intervals.
Yeah.
But one structured workout I have been doing is my Monday VT1 rides. And
Yeah.
basically, it's like a 2 to 3 hour endurance ride, but trying to stay at the top end of my endurance. So, kind of the same thing, a
Yeah.
relatively flat route with some kicks in it, and just kind of trying to stay between 250 and 300 watts and just be as constant on the pedals as much as possible. Um, and then I've been adding in some aero practice in there. So basically doing 5 minutes in my puppy paws position, trying to get small,
Yeah.
and then which is not easy to hold, and then 5 minutes just in a comfortable position. Kind of the same thing. I put in exactly the same playlist. I always do exactly the same route
Yeah.
and just kind of zone out and look at my watts. And those have been my favorite rides every Monday to do things like that.
It's funny just because, with all that time spent doing, and again, all the different types of lifting and all the different types of riding, everything else you do, it's like at the end of the day, I think it says something about potentially the busyness of current lifestyle when all you crave is a certain level of simplicity and being able to like just turn your brain off and do the same task over and over again. It's like, if under any other circumstances, I would be like, I would write that down and say, God, that's a really boring workout. And when I'm doing it, that's all I want to do. There's nothing else I want to do.
Absolutely. And that might be something that we get into with today's topic, because I definitely think that your mental state and your mental approach to the workout is not something that's considered in TSS.
Yeah.
So even though it doesn't change necessarily the physical strain of the workout, I definitely think it changes the mental strain of the workout.
Yeah.
But if we get back to the original question for TSS for strength training. So if you have an athlete that's a hybrid athlete, and say they're doing about a 50-50 split, strength training in the gym to endurance training of some kind, or even a lot of my athletes are right now, because they're in the northern hemisphere, it's kind of like 70% endurance because they want to get outside while it's not winter, and 30% in the gym. How do you consider TSS for those workouts? Is it because it is a significant amount of time, even just at 30%? It is a significant amount of stress. Do you not include it? Do you get them to use a heart rate TSS? Do you get them to calculate the total number of pounds they lifted during the workout and then average it out versus body weight? What's your approach towards that?
See, so what's so hard for me is like, and I'm sure you'll appreciate this, when metrics are developed, anything like TSS or, like even like METs, looking at, the total amount of energy that's burned on a given activity, heart rate zones and all that. Contextually, a lot of these metrics become useful because what you're talking about is you're talking about a fairly consistent stimulus. When you're riding, whether you're riding at, 55% of threshold or riding at 120% of threshold, like it's a relatively rhythmic movement, and we know what the underlying muscles being worked are, what the underlying energy systems being worked are. We know what a relative level of intensity means as far as recovery goes, everything else. It's such a known quantity because it's such a consistent stressor on the body. And I think what makes lifting relatively complicated is that it is such a varied stressor in that regard. The amount of weight you're lifting, the number of sets, the number of repetitions, bracing, balancing, so many other things. You have such a difficult time even quantifying how many calories you would burn in lifting a weight once that it almost becomes an irrelevant metric. And I think something like TSS is really useful because in calculating TSS, when you create a metric, when you create any sort of metric to try to get a sense of overall workload or recovery or anything else, the metric itself doesn't mean anything if you don't know how to interpret the metric.
Yeah.
You go, okay, well, so is a TSS of 350? Is that a lot? Is that a little? Like, I don't know. So then you say, well, okay, it really becomes useful when you start to say, all right, when you have an athlete with this many years of experience and they're training for this event, this is the range of TSS that we typically associate with training for this event. This is considered a little bit on the light side. There's a lot to it. When it comes to lifting, even if we could quantify TSS, what does that mean in terms of stress? We don't know, like, what a high intensity lifting session, how does that contribute to the athlete's ability to recover in between two sessions? And you think, okay, if we don't really have any validated metric that lets us quantify lifting, then is it going to be useful in terms of like future planning? Like, let's say we could take TSS from a training session and say, okay, well, this squat session is 50 TSS. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Is that going to be at all comparable in terms of recovery cost, in terms of glycogen depletion, muscle soreness, athlete mental engagement, cardiovascular stress? With cycling, to a certain extent, you can almost equate power output to cardiovascular stress. Yes, the two of them become decoupled when you do hard sprint workouts. Lots on the legs, maybe less on the lungs, and vice versa. But when you're lifting, the two are almost completely unrelated because so many things are affecting your heart rate when you lift. You're talking about just vascular occlusion and the impact that has on heart rate, and how it's not really oxygen demand, but it's really even just continuing to perfuse contracting muscles that send your heart rate. Like if I do a 1 rep max squat, I can see my systolic blood pressure and heart rate spike, but it's not that the oxygen demands are that great. So what is actually happening? And I think there's such a decoupling of stressor, which is the lifting, and the metrics that are useful for assessing endurance activity, that it's almost like you almost can't compare it.
Yeah,
It's like when
and
people
there's
use,
a lot to unpack in that.
yeah,
It's definitely a good starting point for this because I think it's a good idea to kind of go through how TSS is calculated. So for cycling, it's your normalized power based off of your time. So if you hold your FTP or your VT2, depending on who you ask for an hour, it's 100 TSS. And for those that are not familiar, normalized power is supposed to take into account the spikes in your workouts. So if from memory, it's basically your power every second to the fourth power normalized over 30 seconds to the fourth root. Whatever that basically what that means is whenever anything that's really really high on top of your on top of your FTP is going to be exaggerated. Anything that's really low below zero is going to be basically eliminated, or close to zero is going to be basically eliminated. So if you do two sessions that are, one is 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off for an hour, where your 30 seconds are going up above 150% of FTP, and then you're not pedaling. So basically, it comes to an average of your FTP, but the normalized power is going to be above your FTP. Say you do that for 45 minutes, that might be 100 TSS. But if you hold the same average power for an hour, that will only be 75 TSS. So it tries to take into account the difficulty of the session as well. I think for cycling, for road cycling, it's a good model. But already when we get into running, what we're trying to do, they use a grade adjusted pace to calculate your TSS. Already there is the grade adjusted pace, from what I understand, does not take the athlete weight into consideration. I might be wrong on that. I haven't looked into it that much, but it's basically if you're going up a hill at 6 minutes per kilometer, or if you're going on a flat at 5 minutes kilometer, it's going to consider those about the same based off of your threshold and the individual athlete. So it's trying to adjust for it somewhat. And then when you get into swimming TSS, it does nothing. There's no way for them to account for the current or anything. But then again, when we get into lifting, like Alex mentioned, when you get up to, like, if you're doing a 1RM or if you're doing a set of 10, in theory, at the end of that, if you're at the same reps in reserve or the same RPE, the actual stimulus on your body, in theory, should be about the same. It's not the same stimulus, but the same amount of stress on your body is a better way of putting it. But the actual heart rate change and the actual workload that you're going to be experiencing is going to be much different. So there's no real way to account for that using strength training or any of those other metrics that I've seen. So what I'd have a tendency to do is, for athletes that wear a Garmin watch or an Apple watch or anything like that, and they just wear it profusely all the time, I tell them to just record their gym sessions using that and let the heart rate TSS calculate itself. And we're going to be able to have a pretty good approximation that it was a hard session, it was an easy session. It's going to be close enough. Because for me personally, I don't actually look at TSS in my athletes all that much. I really find it's kind of not a useless metric, but there's a lot of things that I look at before I'll look at TSS for my athletes. So if it's in the ballpark, I'm just going to get them to use heart rate TSS. And even for a lot of endurance, because you mentioned heart rate decoupling and stuff like that, I've started just by default using heart rate TSS for everything instead of trying to individualize it for different sports. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to look at it for strength training as well, is because it's like, hey, look, if you're a single sport athlete and you're really slavishly tracking TSS because you're like, hey, look, all I train are triathletes or all I train are marathon runners, and I've got a good sense for the typical profile of my marathon runner. Here's what I like the TSS scores to be. And sometimes it's interesting. One of the ways I can find it useful sometimes is when I look at prescribed TSS versus actual TSS. And it can sometimes give you a sense of, like you said, TSS is calculated by, sort of on the assumption of the fact that normalized power grades, doing intervals or going hard than easy and hard than easy is a little bit more challenging than what the average would be. You sprint and walk, that's going to be harder than just jogging, even though the net speed may be the same. So if somebody's actual TSS every week is dramatically higher than their program TSS, I'm going to look at it and go, okay, are you, what kind of terrain are you going on here? Are you trying to get Strava segments every time you go down this road? Like, what's going on? So sometimes it's useful for that, but like you said, I don't use it really that much. There's so many things I look at first. And when it comes to lifting, I like the idea of using heart rate TSS because basically what that's going to say is your heart rate TSS for a lifting session is going to be pretty low anyway. I mean, unless you're running through a 30-minute chipper wad, your heart rate's only going to get up high in the middle of a set. And so your average heart rate is going to be 15 beats per minute higher than at rest, which is a pretty good approximation of, hey, you just spent 45 minutes being moderately active. That's going to cause you a little bit of stress. Is it going to be as much cardiovascular stress as biking for an hour? Probably not. But you're looking at other things first because you're not going to prescribe your workouts based on what that heart rate TSS is showing you.
No.
You're not going to go, oh wow, your heart rate TSS on that lifting session was 68 and it should have been 50. Maybe we should make your next lifting session a little bit easier. You're not going to do that. But
No.
you're going to look at it in aggregate and go, wow, okay, yeah, these lifting sessions, that's an hour and a half, fairly high heart rate. Okay, maybe I should think about that and say, maybe we can back off on some of your work a little bit because you're spending a lot of time under some moderate cardiovascular stress. So I think in that regard, it's more of a, is it useful to measure? Should you track it? I feel like it's a judgment call as to whether or not you should even use it for lifting or just discard it entirely and say, yeah, you know what? If you shouldn't look at your lifting sessions in terms of TSS or in terms of calories burned or anything else. It's going to have its own very discrete stressors that are better tracked almost independently of everything else. Like you want to track it in terms of muscle soreness. You want to track it in terms of, lift progression and velocity and things like that. It's almost like it's its own completely different set of criteria that you can't use things that are meant as a proxy for overall cardiovascular energetic stress like TSS or calories burned. That doesn't really apply to lifting because it's so different.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah,
And I like the point that you brought up with someone working very specifically, where say someone, if we go to the extreme of most specificity is like a 5,000 or a 10,000 runner on the track, where basically the conditions are extremely controlled. It's always the same. They know their paces from everything from 800 up to a full marathon with extreme precision, and they're actual strength training volume when depending on where they are in their season is less than 20% of their
yeah,
actual total volume. For athletes like that, tracking TSS for your strength sessions is probably pretty useless, and it's
yeah,
probably just going to cause more error because there'll be one day where you're tired in the gym and your heart rate is just 20 beats higher just because you're tired, and
yeah,
it's going to throw everything off. But for hybrid athletes where you're looking at is considering in time 30% or probably more of your training volume, that's where I think at least having some kind of metric, some kind of consideration behind it is interesting.
yeah,
But I don't think it was worth spending more than 30 seconds trying to figure out what it is. I've
yeah,
had athletes in the past where I got them to fill out on TrainingPeaks the score of from 0 to 10 of how hard it was, and basically multiply that number by 5, and I put that TSS in their workout. And that
Yeah.
was kind of a way I did it before. And there was definitely a good correlation between doing that and just using heart rate TSS. So after that, I just said, just use heart rate TSS, and it's
Yeah.
going to be close enough.
Yeah, and I think that's worth noting too, because like you said, hybrid athletes do end up spending more time actually lifting, more variety of sessions and all that. It's just, my thing is always, especially with a lot of these things that are arrived at, almost empirically derived. Because TSS only has value as far as we know what high versus low TSS means for different athlete types. And we know what's sustainable and what's not, because we have a general idea of how much threshold work an athlete can do before they start burning out. Since we're talking about a pretty arena specific figure, trying to apply something specific to something more general, or trying to get a very precise figure for something that is, we don't really know what that precise figure means in strength training. It's like, why are we using a very precise specific tool for a very imprecise, less specific objective? So yeah, like I said, I like that idea of just putting it to heart rate TSS and using that to help track general trends. But I think it also drives home that, hey, look, if you're a hybrid athlete, a multi-sport athlete, TSS in general might be a less relevant figure for you, especially because. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, finish your thought. I was going to move on to the next idea that I wanted to ask you about.
Well, I was going to say, especially because you also have athletes that are dealing with a lot more variables when it comes to their endurance performance. You're going to have tired legs. You're going to have depleted glycogen. You're going to have a lot of other things that might affect that decoupling, that might affect your discrete power output. You're going to have a lot more question marks, a lot more things getting thrown into your endurance performance that an obligate endurance athlete might not have to deal with. So, yeah.
So that was exactly my next point that I wanted to bring up is, in general, one of the problems with TSS is it assumes that your threshold is a fixed number.
Oh, man, yeah.
And so for me, I'm a cyclist. I always go back to FTP, and a lot of cyclists, they kind of wear their FTP as a badge of honor, especially a lot of heavier athletes. They like to throw it out there, and then lighter athletes, they talk about watts per kilo. So I'll put it to myself as an example. I have not actually tested my FTP in about 3 years because I had 3 seasons back to back where in the winter my FTP started out about 350, 360, and then by the fall it was about 380, 390, and then it dropped back down to 350, 360. I was like, well, I'm just always getting the same numbers. I'm going to try not testing and based off of performances. So I'm going to adjust my FTP so that I get the right numbers. Sorry, my dog's barking. So that I get the right numbers during my training. Because really all we're trying to do is approximate your threshold so that when you go to do a session, you're doing them at the right intensity and we can estimate the right intensity properly. So right now my FTP, I did a race and I did 8 minutes at 430 watts in the first hill. So I estimate FTP off that at 380. So my FTP right now is at 380. But when I do a threshold or a VO2 session, I give myself like a 10 to 15% range because I know based off of how I'm feeling, the temperature on that day, what I did yesterday, what I ate before, if I had caffeine before, my threshold could be 10 to 15% lower or higher. So, and in theory, say I have a bad day and my actual threshold is 350 for the day and I do my tempo session maybe at the lower end of my bracket, the TSS in theory should be actually higher because my real threshold that should be used to calculate it is lower than my actual threshold that I have in TrainingPeaks. So even in the situation of something super controlled like cycling, there's going to be a lot of room for error when calculating all these values.
Well, and it's true, like little things, like even just understanding physiologically what's technically going on at your threshold. And what you're looking at is, of course, that critical inflection point where, your maximum sustainable output. This is before we get to going too heavily anaerobic and therefore, it's unsustainable. And, you're kind of on a fixed timeline before you start to lose performance. You think, okay, well, yeah, it is so prone to hydration levels. If your blood volume drops ever so slightly, circulation goes down. If the pH of your blood is slightly, if glycogen levels, are slightly different, you've just eaten a lot recently versus too little. That's going to impact the amount of free glucose, liver glucose, everything else. All of that's really going to impact where that line is and where that threshold is. So with that much variable in it, like you said, even with something carefully controlled like that, we have to be careful how much attention we pay to this. Because with a lot of my athletes, I'll even have, when I do some athletes who have, like, let's say, more time on weekends to do like longer rides or anything else, those are longer workouts. There's usually, kind of their Saturday FTP versus kind of their Thursday FTP. It's totally different.
And their FTP at the beginning of the ride Saturday when they just had a coffee and a croissant before meeting their friends.
Yeah.
And then their Saturday FTP 5 hours in when they're completely bonked because they forgot to eat, and
Exactly.
different.
Exactly. And I think this all drives home the point that, like, what we're trying to do, a lot of these figures are just meant to be kind of guidelines and tools to give coaches that they can, it gives them a starting point to adjust intensities. It gives you a starting point to understand the big picture. But, there's considerable flex within them. And like you said, wearing your FTP is a badge of pride. It's like, okay, this is all well and good. But even then, what does your FTP tell you? And I know they attempt to answer this with like critical power and everything else. But what does your FTP tell you? If you got an FTP of 400, what does that tell you about how many times you can, do surges up to 450 over the course of a race before you hit a wall? Does that tell you anything whatsoever? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and just for reference, I mentioned my numbers there. It wasn't with the intention to brag. It was just to give some context.
Yeah.
I'm heavy, so those numbers are barely 4 watts per kilo, so it's nothing impressive. I'm well aware of that. But if we go into it, if we go even further, like if we get into running, it gets even more murky, because if someone does, there's actually a question about this for the templates, because there's someone asking the question of, they set their 5K or 10K PR at this, and they felt like the tempo values were a bit conservative. But when we talk about threshold for running, we don't know if it's an athlete you're coaching individually, but if it's just in general, you don't know if someone set that on a 400-meter track doing 25 and a half laps to do their 5K, or if that was a 5K trail run. And we've seen people doing all kinds of things between it. So when we get into running or swimming or anything where we're measuring the result of the output and not the actual output itself. So power is an actual direct measurement of the energy that you're outputting, whereas your pace is how that energy is used. We're going to have even more error when considering running versus cycling or something like that because of the terrain factor.
So here's a question for you. What do you think of power meters for running?
I like them. I have athletes that use them. I kind of apply the same idea that I do for cycling, where I have them test their FTP. Usually I just estimate their FTP off of a 5K or a 10K threshold test. And then I kind of apply the same zones, because in theory, power should be a linear, regardless of the modality, it should be a linear function, versus pace should be a quadratic function based off of the output. So 150 to 105 to 120% of your running power is VO2. Below that is going to be a tempo threshold. And I still don't trust running power for judging endurance. Like I don't trust power meters for judging endurance on the bike either. Then for both of them, I tend to use like a heart rate bracketing method versus an actual assigned power.
Yeah, I was going to say, because, on your bike, one of the things is always when you work with triathletes, especially, and I'm sure you've seen this, they're like, well, what exact percent of my FTP should I be riding at during my Ironman? And I'm like, 73.5%. They're right, really? But I read on the internet that I should be 77.4. And you're just like, oh, no, okay. But it is. It's, when it comes to that sort of intensity, that sort of lower intensity, it's not that applicable.
No, definitely not, because we talk about it being a linear function, but once you get to the extremes, and extremes being plus or minus 20% from your actual FTP, then it's going to break down. Because me personally, I'm a very anaerobic athlete. You gave the example of being able to punch repeatedly. For me, doing 90 seconds on, 90 seconds off is my favorite session. But doing 8 minutes, more than 12 minutes at tempo, and I hate everything.
Right.
So
Oh no.
and even then, when you get into TSS, if physiologically I'm better at those 90 seconds on, 90 seconds off versus the 4 by 12 minutes at tempo, it
Yeah.
might be the same TSS for this session, but for me going into the 90 seconds session, I'm stoked. I'm eating my carbs. I want to kill that session. I'm waiting to the best moment of the day. I'm putting on my skin suit, everything to make it work. And then if I have that 4 by 12 minute session, I'm like, I could just go do that group ride, and I'll probably spend like just below an hour at
Yeah.
tempo, and it'll be close enough.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be completely different from a mental standpoint. And I think that's something that really needs to be taken into consideration more. And that's something that as a coach,
Yeah.
you're able to take into consideration more that you might not be able to just looking at a number.
Honestly, yeah, and that's the old classics like the 2 by 20 minute. Nobody gets that one because nobody likes that one. I can't think of a single human being on earth who ever wants to do that session. And it's one of those where yeah, you look at it and you look at the stimulus you want to get out of it, and you think yeah, but that athlete is probably they're not they themselves are not well equipped mentally or otherwise to really hit this session the way it should be done. So, is this the best way to achieve that goal?
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
So if we get back to like how do we actually use TSS and how we actually look at it, for me personally, the way I look at it for athletes is I kind of see TSS in blocks of 100. So if someone is in within 100 TSS of their average, or within 50 TSS of their average, everything's normal. If they have a couple weeks where they're dipping below this, then I might consider that they're actually doing less volume than normal. If they have a couple weeks where they're going above it, we might want to scale it back. And I'll use myself as an example. This spring, I was getting ready for a race. The track at 200 gravel, so it was a 200-kilometer race. I was doing quite a bit of volume, and the 4 weeks out from that, I started my peaking block. I did a 20-hour week with 900 TSS, and then the week after that, I did a 17-hour week with 750 TSS. The week before my race, it was 12 hours with like 400 TSS. And then the week of the race, it was 14 hours with like 750 TSS. So obviously stepping down from 900 to 700 to 400, those are big jumps. But the difference between my 700 and my 770 for the week of the race, those are the same weeks in my opinion, even though there's like a 10% difference in the actual TSS. I don't know if you have a different opinion than me.
no, I think that's a really, really good way to look at it because what you're talking about is rather than getting caught up in the very, very minute details, which can be subject to so much, you're using this as sort of a big picture to say, okay, this is roughly a way to calculate overall percentage. Because if you don't have something like TSS, you could look at 2 weeks with dramatically different workouts, different interval lengths, interval types, and everything else. You go, well, how does this really compare, like in terms of stress? And it's a useful number for saying, okay, these are two dramatically different weeks, but the TSS in both of them was about 500. So I'm going, okay, these are kind of in the same ballpark. Now, obviously, if one is all 30 seconds on, 30-second off sprints, and the other week is all just easy cruising, you're going, okay, maybe I can't compare that. But if you're like, you like most of our programs, you've got, here's my interval session, here's my hard interval session, here are my tempo sessions, and all that, and you're kind of trying to look to see how this compares, and you think, okay, I want to put in a taper here. I want to put in the same framework. This week seems a little easier. Is it really easier? And I look at my TSS and it's gone down 150 points. I go, okay, cool. I'm on the right track here. Yep. And that's kind of, again, it's like any other big picture tool.
Yeah. And I think TrainingPeaks, they try to do this using the fitness and the fatigue scores that you see at the end of the week. Yeah. I'd be interested in getting your opinion on those, whether they're actually useful or if you actually look at them as well. Or is that just a step too far where they've tried to do too much and it ends up being not as useful as they want it to be?
Yeah, I honestly, I don't really look at those. I've looked at the algorithms that go into it and I'm going, my thing with any sort of training metric is if I get this, is it descriptive? Is it prescriptive in any regard? Like, am I getting anything out of this? Is this telling me anything new? And is this going to change my practice because of it? Yeah. And if not, to me, I'm going, then you know what? There's way too much other stuff to track. I have not found those to appreciably add to my coaching practice in any regard, so I haven't used them.
I do have a tendency to look at the fatigue score occasionally, but again, I kind of see it as in blocks of 10. So if someone suddenly over a week jumps up 10 points,
Yeah,
really that just means that they accumulated a lot of TSS that week, anyways.
yeah,
So that's something I will take into consideration. But yeah, the algorithm for it is like your 6 week average TSS plus your, I don't know it exactly off the top of my head, but it ends up being so complicated that it ends up just being like your 6 week average TSS overall.
yeah,
So
and
it's
it,
not really all that useful other than just looking at the numbers. And
yeah,
I do think fitness is a very poor name for what they're trying to do, because if I go into my example as well, those 2 weeks where I was doing less work um, because I was tapering into a race, my fitness score was going down because my overall average TSS daily was lower.
yeah,
But I was hitting numbers, better numbers than I ever had before. I was flying on the bike because I was recovered. So is TSS the work, or is my fitness something I want to associate with doing work? Or is it just some, is my actual ability to do more work on top of it? So I
yeah.
like to think of that fitness number as your average work capacity versus your actual your average preparedness to do work than your actual fitness.
It's funny because when it comes down to like the whole idea of like fitness masking fatigue, the whole idea is that putting this in, like I say, a lifting context, your squat fitness is at its highest right after you finish a squat workout.
Yeah.
And you're going, okay, yeah, but I can barely move my legs. How can my fitness be the highest? Going, well, the movement is the most practiced, is the most ingrained right now. You have literally just done the movement. Your fitness is super high. It's just your fatigue is also super high. So the
Yeah.
whole idea is, okay, well, every second that goes by after I stop squatting, my fitness is dropping because I'm not squatting anymore, but my fatigue is dropping faster. And
Yeah.
it's like, okay, that's all well and good, but how practical is that really to call that my squat fitness? If by definition, when your fitness is the highest, you've just done something to the point of sheer exhaustion, so you can't exhibit any of that. Like, is that really useful? And I think a lot of these metrics that sort of just replate numbers you already can see, hey, all we're doing is tracking your TSS over time and this and the other. You're going, okay, this is not. He said, is a metric descriptive? Is it prescriptive? And is it predictive as
Yeah.
well? And
That,
I think,
that's a really interesting way of putting it, and I honestly would say, because I'm sure you get this question a lot when you talk with new athletes. They ask, "Do you want me to put my morning HRV? Do you want me to put my morning Whoop score and TrainingPeaks?" And usually my response is, if it does it automatically, let it happen because it's interesting to see. But if you're going to put effort into entering those things in manual every day,
yeah,
forget about it. Because though I those things are interesting, it's a good idea. It can be a good idea to track them long term to see general trends.
yep.
But as far as actually prescribing what you're supposed to be doing with those metrics, I think we're one or two, maybe three generations of development before we actually get to it
Yeah.
being useful, more than just general trends.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think especially because there's a lot of oversimplification that comes with those things as
Mm-hmm.
well. Like even in HRV, if you look at how, and this I know this is going off a completely different topic, but I think it's sort of interesting for people who are tracking these things anyway. With HRV, what you're looking at is what is it, the root mean square, standard deviation, and it's just and that's kind of what most HRV is looking at right now is the standard deviation between beasts. Is that going up? Is it going down? But in a clinical setting, they're also looking at overall larger patterns over the course of the day. There's low frequency, high frequency, very low frequency variation, which in a clinical setting, these are things that where you are constantly monitoring your HRV over 24 hours and looking at the patterns of variance, not just the variance over the course of the day, but the patterns of variance. Like if you look on your watch at your HRV score during the day, you're going to see it looks like this crazy bar graph that goes up and down. Well, the shape of that crazy bar graph is in itself a critical variable to look at when you're really trying to use this as a tool for tracking overall. Like they're still experimenting and saying, what does this particular low frequency pattern over 72 hours mean? What does this pattern mean when we see it in heart patients over 3 weeks? So you can't get any of that from your device, and you take the damn thing off to charge it, and you're screwing up the data. So you're going, Okay. Even a lot of the stuff that HRV could be used for, we don't have the capacity to use it for in the metric, in the way we're using it. So if we're saying that, minute to minute HRV is telling me, hey, I'm ready right now, but it's not really looking at all these other patterns that are just as important. Are we getting actionable data here, or are we just getting stuff that's cool to look at?
And just from like an interesting side note, if we look at a lot of ideas in physics and whatnot, and there's people that will disagree with me on this for sure, but like the base order is interesting. The second order is not as interesting, and then the order after that is usually where things get interesting. So when you look at like if you look at just a wave moving, that's cool to know. If you try and go in this first order of that wave, there's not a whole lot that you can new things that you can tell from it. But when you get into the second order and you get into your wave equation is when you actually start to find out some other things. I hadn't made that connection before, that with the human body, with all the metrics we're trying to measure it might actually be the same thing where we're just not measuring things at the order of magnitude or at the order of depth going into the frequency domain like we should when we're looking at metrics for the human body.
Well, because it's fascinating, because you're looking at HRV in the context of things like circadian rhythm, for example, and the fact that your HRV changes with different body temperatures at different times during the day and all that. And, you look at how circadian perturbations can change even over time and what that might mean. There's so many other things where you start to see these patterns emerge, because we're looking, when we look at HRV, when we look at TSS, when we look at all these things, what we're doing is we're trying to put a number to a set of 1,000 underlying physical variables. When we look at TSS, we're saying, okay, well, that's based on threshold. And threshold is based on, we're looking at onset of blood lactate accumulation, which is really a combination of cellular factors and circulation factors. We're like, okay, so we're taking 100 variables, 1,000 variables, and putting them into one number. But now, when we have the human body, we have all these different numbers that we're looking at that are, each one of those variables changes over time. And there's 100 different things that goes into how each one of these 100 variables change. So we can't really create a model of something unless we can really zoom all the way out and see where it's moving.
So you're saying that continuous lactate monitors are not the solution to everything?
Oh my God.
That might be a topic that would be interesting to go into for another podcast. The benefit, the potential benefit versus potential nothing burger of a continuous lactate monitor versus just looking at your heart rate. I definitely think it's an interesting emerging thing that's coming up, but I, like a lot of things, I think it's being exaggerated. Its utility is being exaggerated a lot more than it will actually be.
I do have one slight theory on that, and I think that is because old habits die hard. And old perspectives on things like lactate still very much impact how we view changing lactate levels.
Mm-hmm.
Like, rather than seeing lactate itself as a spillover effect, and as just as much related to glycogen levels and blood plasma volume and everything else, we still see it as an indication of overall, like, a pure intensity, or even this idea that since it's a waste product, which it's not, its accumulation can tell us something, which it doesn't. And if you view lactate then as lactate itself can be a buffer for acidic conditions, and you're going, okay, so if it's a buffer, then so many other things that I think our imperfect understanding of lactate has still dictated the development of some technology. And I think because of that, we're kind of starting out on the wrong foot. But that's a much bigger discussion. I'm sure there are going to be some people who hear that and go, what are you talking about? Like, elite teams use this and it's great and everything else. And it's another discussion.
There's a lot of things that elite teams use that should not be touched by amateur athletes, just because either it's too far or it's just not useful unless you're continuously, and I don't mean continuously as in it's always measuring, as in continuously, like every single session you're taking measurements. Because we look at the Norwegian method and they're using it basically after every interval. They're measuring lactate before and after, and there's some interesting things behind that. Is that useful for someone that's doing things other than running repeated 1500s on a track? It remains to be seen. I'm not going to tell all my clients to buy one right away, personally.
And I think that's a really, really good point. There is consistency of measurement is often what makes a measurement useful. if you use it inconsistently, if you only test it some of the time, if you only test it under certain conditions, is it really useful? Same thing with FTP, like you were just
Yeah.
talking about that. If unless you have a really good sense of what your threshold is, under every conceivable circumstance. Yeah, here's my functional threshold on a day when it's 40 degrees out. Here's my threshold on a day when it's near freezing. Like knowing all of that, like if you don't know that, then you're missing out on a critical part of its utility. So are we paying too much attention to numbers that are based on incomplete data sets?
Yeah. And absolutely, we are. I definitely think that's one of the errors that I would say intermediate athletes. There's always those memes that come out of where it's the normalized graph and it's the newbie and then the middle, the intermediate, and the expert comes back to the beginning. I've done it myself with my own coaching where I went from this is hard, medium, easy. And then when I was like, oh, you have to be at this exact percentage for this exact amount of time, and it's really, really important. And now it's 4 by 8 minutes hard, and whatever hard is on that day,
That's what you do.
that's what hard is on that day. And if it's not what we want to do in that session, well, next week we're going to do a very, very similar session, and we'll learn from that first session about how to better guide that next session based off of what the athlete was feeling, what their feedback was to me, rather than being too specific on it.
And what I think the key takeaway is from that, because eventually you don't want to go full nihilistic and just say, well, nothing matters. But I think there really is the fact that a lot of studies that have looked at things like the utility of heart rate variability in tracking training readiness. One of the things they always measure it against is the athlete survey, the athlete questionnaire. Like, okay, well, look, HRV tracks like with a p-value or whatever compared to this questionnaire, so it must be good. And you're going, okay, wait a minute. So at the end of the day, you're saying that this statistic, this metric is useful because it comes pretty close to just asking athletes how they feel.
Yeah.
And what I think the best takeaway there is that subjective athlete feedback is, of course, an incredible tool. And I think one thing that's underutilized.
Yeah.
But I think one of the most important things is that coaches give their athletes the language they need to actually describe how they're feeling. And they kind of empower their athletes to say, okay, don't just say I'm feeling good or saying bad. Like, be able to describe how you're feeling. And, give the athlete, even if it's just a series of like 5 or 6 questions to ask themselves over the course of a workout. And these questions some of them be subjective, like, how excited did you feel about doing this workout? Halfway through the workout, when things got tough, was your first instinct to power through it? Or was it that you wanted to back off and do something else?
Interesting.
When the workout was done, how did you feel? Did you feel accomplished, or did you feel glad that the workout was over? And so giving them kind of leading questions like that is such a powerful tool for actually being able to assign difficulty for workout and progression. And I think a lot of this stuff and looking at variables and all that, we don't want to lose that language with athletes. And I think we should encourage that even more.
And that comes up to kind of the last topic that I wanted to get into, and I think is probably the most important one, is what would be for you? What would you say? TrainingPeaks were to hire CHP to consult them for the version whatever of TSS, the version 2 of TSS, or a replacement for TSS. What would be the kind of metric that you'd want to see? And my response was actually if they could give, because you have the option when you've completed a workout to give, there's like 5 different smileys, and then there's 10 from 0 to 10. I tell my athletes to do the smiley is how excited you were going before the workout, how you were feeling going into the workout, and then the score from 0 to 10 is how hard the workout was. And if TrainingPeaks were to create a graph where they're to do the average mood based off of the smileys, and then the average athlete perception of difficulty, I think that would be a huge replacement for TSS. That would be extremely useful. I would love to see.
I would actually, like I said, I would, as an adjunct to something like that, I would say the same, because one of the things I've really looked at, one of the things I constantly look at with athlete workouts is where that smiley face is and where the 1 through 10 is. And to me, that is so much more important than anything else, especially when I have athletes who are doing mixed modal stuff, especially, and I don't want to say hybrid athletes are special, but they really are in a lot of ways, because you have athletes who are doing a lot of different things that may be a little more outside their comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
If athletes only did the thing they were best suited at, they would never do the whole hybrid thing. They would just say, hey, I just want to do this. People get into a lot of this style of training because they're trying something different, or they're trying a new sport, or they're trying to expand their horizons. It's going to, by definition, force them into areas that they don't have a huge frame of reference for working within. And I think that subjective feedback and being able to have a metric that says generally, how are you feeling week to week?
Yeah.
I know as soon as you try to put a number on something, it immediately becomes a less useful tool. I hate to say that, but it really is. Especially speaking to someone from a math and physics background, it's like as soon as you can quantify it, it's terrible. But I feel like you always appreciate that more than anybody.
Yeah, I guess if you go far enough in physics, it ends up being the same thing. So and when you're dealing with humans and dealing with actually people's perception of it, I do agree, because even just asking someone like, "How did you feel out of 10 for that workout?" There's always the question, "Well, like, how did I feel? How did I feel? Like, is it how hard the workout was? Was it like was it how hard the last interval was? Was it how all these kinds of different ways of considering how hard a workout was?" And me personally, I just respond, whatever your first instinct was is the right answer. But once again, if you put even more importance on that number, it does become less useful because people are going to overthink it a little bit.
And I think that's why it has to be two. It has to be how excited about it were you, and how hard was it? Because we all know athletes who are like, this workout looks like an ass kicker. I can't wait. And they get done with it. They're like, I am smashed. That was amazing. Please, more of that. And then you get ones that are like, oh, that looks like it's going to be tough. I'm not there right now. And because I think tracking both of those is so crucially important, because it's on top of all this, we want to get the impression that having an athlete work harder and having them be more smashed is not necessarily a bad thing for the athlete if they're in an otherwise state of mind, physical state, and lifestyle state where that's exactly what they want.
Absolutely.
And they can still overtrain, but athletes get overtrained and overreach so much faster when they are dreading the sessions.
And
So,
I'm experiencing that myself this year, that since I am doing a higher higher race schedule and racing crits or road races every week, and
yeah,
doing less actual intensity workouts,
yeah,
my actual average volume each week has been higher this year than it is before. Part
yeah,
of that is lifestyle factors of changing jobs and all the kinds of things like that. In my adult job, not my coaching job. But I've been able to maintain 2 or 3 extra hours of total training a week. But instead of doing structured workouts, I'm going and racing a crit every week. And
yeah,
I guarantee that at the end of that crit, I've done more work than I would in an hour of doing 4-minute intervals,
yeah,
because I'm racing for my team. I have the ego going on.
yeah.
I love cutting the inside line on corners and gaining 20 places. I love that side of it. So I'm doing more work, but with less stress, just because it's a different context. And probably overall through my season, that extra 2 or 3 hours a week, because I'm having more fun instead of doing structured workouts, is going to be better off than doing exactly the perfect workout that I should be doing at that point in the year.
And it's funny, I think, because there's a lot to be said, because I think there might still be a school of thought that says, well, you could still do too much work, even if you're
Yeah.
loving it, you can still do, and that's absolutely true. But I think, for all we talk about how important recovery is and everything else, it's so important to know that a happy athlete they're probably going to be sleeping better, they're probably going to be a little better prepared for the sessions, their mental state is going to be better. Overall stress levels, if you're looking forward to workouts and you're viewing them as something you're excited to do, net level, that's going to be the whole like eustress sort of thing, not the negative stress sort of thing. And there's a lot to be said for what that does to you, what that does to your sleep, what that does to your mindset. And all of that has actual physiological effects. So people may say, well, look, hard work is hard work. And if you love going out there and smashing yourself, your body's still just as bad off as if you hated going out there and smashing yourself. But you're saying, well, but humans don't really work that way. Like,
No.
yeah, it's the difference between being excited to go do a workout, being really hyped and positive about it, and and all that, what that's going to do for your mindset leading up to it, and how well you sleep the night before, for example, is going to be really different than if you're dreading something every day of the week.
And I definitely still have to pay attention to my recovery. Like I still notice if I skip my rest day for the week, or if I skip my active recovery. For me, active recovery is going to play golf, and if I
Yeah,
go and do an extra bike ride instead of doing that,
yeah,
I still notice it in my actual level. So there is some importance to making sure I'm recovering and everything, but what I need to do to recover is a lot lower than it used to be
Yeah,
because of that. And that's part of the advantage of working with coaches or working with the training partners or whatever it is, just having someone outside of yourself looking at your training, because they may be able to find ways that trick you into doing more work with less stress, which is going to
exactly.
be overall is going to be a lot better.
Exactly. Yep. And that becomes a positive. So, and that's the gold standard. That's what we're looking for at the end of the day is how do I get, obviously, real life comes into play, but you go, how do I do as much quality work as possible with the least amount of mental and physical negatives, the least amount of mental and physical stress. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
I think it's a good way to leave that off for today.
Cool.
So thanks everyone for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to leave it in the comments or reach out to CHP via Instagram. If you have any recommendations for how for other topics that you would like us to get into a bit more detail, kind of this more. I know Alex gets a lot of questions for his weekly Q&As, but I know some of them would be really interesting to go a bit more in depth with.
Yeah.
And I know some of them there's like, oh, I have such a good thing to say about that. So if we have any other good topics, we'll definitely do this again.
Cool.
And TrainingPeaks, I think we gave you a few really good ideas about things to add to your app. So if you wanna reach out about how to do that, I work as a product manager in my adult job, so I can definitely help out with that.
Excellent.
Well, thanks for your time, Alex, and thanks
Yeah.
again to everyone for listening.
Yeah. That was awesome. Appreciate it.
Bye.